So good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Christina Katt-Pawlowitsch. I don't know if we have to add Kat or not now. It's on your website. So Christina is professor at Université Paris-Panthéon-Assas. It used to be called Paris 2. Her work appear in top game theory journal and also in you have many papers in Journal of Theoretical Biology, which is I guess the top one in this area. Thank you very much, Christina, for accepting my invitation. And the floor is yours. So we have 1 hour, including questions. This is an informal seminar, so normally if we have questions, we jump in, unless you prefer that we keep all questions to the end. Up to you.
Okay, thanks a lot, George, and thanks a lot for this very kind invitation. It's a pleasure to me to be able to share or to give some insight in this work. So what I will do is I will give an overview of 3 papers or this is current work together with Josef Hofbauer on the evolutionary dynamics of costly signaling or in costly signaling games. So as I said, I give an overview of 3 papers. 2 of them are published and 1 is work in progress. And so costly signaling is, of course, a very well-established research paradigm in economics, but also in theoretical biology. In theoretical biology, it is more known under the name of the handicap principle. This goes back to works by Zahavi in the 1970s. And it was also in the 1970s that Spence introduced his model of signaling, costly signaling in the job market. And so what I try to show in this first slide here is to give you some impression of the range of applications of costly signaling. So I feel almost that when one starts to use this paradigm of costly signaling to interpret the world around us, it's hard to see not costly signaling everywhere, so to say. Here I have just given some examples, some applications that have been discussed in the literature, in biology or in economics. So the first one stands for education as a costly signal. The second, let me explain what you see in this picture here. So you see a huge advertisement in the streets of Paris. And advertising is very costly. And this has been argued by economists that advertising is actually a form of costly signaling. So it's not so much that information is transported by advertising, but the information is in the cost of the advertisement, actually. The most famous example of costly signaling in biology is, of course, the example used by Zahavi, the peacock's tail. And that posed a problem or poses a problem in the paradigm of natural selection, because one could think that such a powerful or such an impressive tail is a handicap or is in contradiction to the fitness of an individual carrying it. And Zahavi, in the context in the context of this question, advanced this idea that so usually the explanation was that females have a preference for this trait, and this is why it pays off for males to express this trait. And the work of Zahavi consisted in kind of incorporating this explanation within the paradigm of natural selection by arguing that only a male with a very high background fitness can actually afford to carry that handicap. So that was the story of Zahavi. And another application from biology, very fitting to what we have currently outside, more beautiful in Canada. So the coloration of autumn leaves, because it so happens that the leaves, they do not just lose color, they don't lose pigments, they produce new pigments. And that is actually a cost. And that's in a way puzzling, because why would the tree do that if the leaves are very shortly after that going to fall off? And so the explanation advanced by biologists was to say this is a costly signal to potential parasites to say, okay, the tree is as if the tree were saying, okay, I'm so strong, I can produce these new pigments, so it doesn't pay off to come to me, so to say. Okay, so of course, I'm sorry for these long stories. Yeah, so maybe I should move on quicker to the model, but let me still mention that of course there are as often precursors of the theoretical models that we do with game theory, and definitely the idea of costly signaling has been captured by Thorsten Veblen in his theory of the leisure class, where he discusses, for example, fashion as a form of conspicuous consumption. Now, let me motivate now more from a theoretical point of view why we looked at dynamics, evolutionary dynamics in costly signaling games. This is such an established research paradigm. So one could say, well, has this not been done before? And in fact, it was not done in a very, let's say, thorough, satisfactory way. So what we do in this work is more in the sense of cleaning up the literature and completing the literature, and not really doing something revolutionarily new, so to say. There are some works, interestingly, Spence, already in his original paper in the 1970s, I'm sorry, I need just a sip. Spence, this is maybe also worth mentioning, that nowadays we use game theory as the framework to model costly signaling phenomena. But Spence in his paper actually used the language and the framework of economic partial equilibrium analysis. It was not really a fully closed game that he has written down. And to justify this equilibrium concept that is more in the spirit of partial equilibrium, he uses actually dynamic story. So what he tells us in words, but there is no real analysis of the dynamics in his model. Later, there were some works by Nölleke and Samuelson, but this is more in the sense of, this is not in the sense of an evolutionary dynamics, what they model. And then there were some works by people coming more from theoretical biology, works by Wagner and Solman and Huttecker, but the analysis was not very, let's say, it was executed in rather broad strokes. So what we do is we give a more detailed analysis of this. What we do is, so now comes really the model. We look at a very simplified model. We look at a very simple model where we are going to have two states of the world, high and low, and two signals, a signal, a costly signal, like for example, having a degree from a certain school or not having a degree from a certain school, which we denote by S bar. And there are going to be two actions. So the action will always be accept or do not accept the job candidate, for example, denoted by A and P bar. And then, so I will, for the purpose of this talk, actually, I will I will discuss a very standard signaling game, which I will show you right away. So this is the game I'm going to talk about. This is the extensive form of the game I'm going to talk about. And maybe to introduce that game, what we should have in mind is the standard job market story. So there is a state of nature capturing the asymmetric information that we have here. There is a job candidate, so that's our player one. And this job candidate can be highly productive, or if you wish, motivated, or not highly productive, highly motivated. So we assume, or we write that with the probability little p, that's the high type, 1 minus p, that's the low type. And now this job candidate can have expressed a costly signal or not, so S and S bar. And both types in principle have this possibility to express the costly signal or not to express the costly signal. And player two then in this game tree, we have the information sets of player two. So player two sees, okay, a signal has been expressed or not, but of course still cannot distinguish the type of player one, high type or low type. And then conditional on the signal that has been observed or the signal or the absence of the signal, player two, who is the firm who wants to hire, for example, decides to accept or not to accept A or A bar. And now what we do, so let me first focus on a very simple case, which is the case where we make the assumption, and this is very much along the lines of what Spence does in his original model. We make the assumption that the signal really has a higher cost of production for the low type. So the low type really needs more time and effort or resources to produce the signal. That fits very well the job market story, because we can assume that someone who is really motivated, let's say someone who really wants to be a doctor, for such a person, it's easier to pass the exams and so on. So it's easier to get a degree. So the payoffs in our game are also such that the second player is only interested in the type of the first player, high or low. So the signal has no direct payoff relevant effect for the second player, only for the first player. And before the signals, the signal cost, so to say, the signaling cost structure sits on a basic payoff structure, which has the following form, that player one, no matter what his type, always wants to be accepted. And in that case, if he is accepted, he gets a payoff of 1. And if he's not accepted, he gets a base payoff of 0. And for player two, it's the other way around. So for player two, sorry, it's not the other way around. For player two, so she gets a payoff of 1 if she accepts the high type, and the payoff of 0 if she happens to accept the low type. So this defines the payoffs that we have here. And for the first player, from this 1 or 0, we subtract the signaling costs, which are C1 or for the high type and C2 for the low type. So now we want to do evolutionary dynamics. So we are going to look at the replicator dynamics and best response dynamics. And so, of course, what we need to do is to translate that payoff, that game tree into a payoff matrix, which is what we do here. And it gives us a payoff matrix 4 by 4, of course, because every player has 2 different roles, so to say, 2 different agents in this extensive form. And for player 1, so we have an action for player 1 in the role of the high type and an action in the role of the low type. We use the convention here that in the first position, so the strategy SS bar means what is written in the first position is the action of the high type, and in the second position, the action of the low type. And for player 2, so it's accept or not accept. And in the first position, we have the action conditional on having seen the signal. And in the second position, we have the action conditional on having not seen the signal. And so to determine the payoffs, one just has to play through all these possible combinations of actions here, given the type. And we pre-multiply with the probabilities of the types. So this gives us these 4 times 4 payoff matrix. Now, what we do, of course, in such a game, I'm not talking about the dynamics yet. I'm still talking about setting up the game that we want to analyze. The payoffs. So let me first say a few words on the payoff structure in this game. The payoff structure in this game, or the payoffs in this game, of course, depends on 2 factors. Depends first on the prior probability P that we have on the high type, and depends also on the cost factor. And just to have an example, I will first look, so what we do in our works, we go through a number of case studies where we look at paradigmatic constellations of this prior probability and the cost factors. And we play it through, actually, through all various combinations. Now, I look at the case, for the purpose of this talk, I look at the case, which is maybe the most interesting and intuitive one, is the case that the cost for both types are strictly between what they get, so are strictly between the cost of the signal and what they could possibly get from being accepted. So are strictly, or are between 0 and 1 for both types. And also we make the assumption that the cost of the signal for the for the high type is strictly lower than the cost of the signal for the high type. Could be 0, the cost of the signal for the low type, for the high type. That doesn't change the equilibrium structure, but for the low type, the cost has to be strictly smaller than 1. This is the case I'm looking at now. It can be higher than 1, but then we get a different equilibrium structure. And so I think I will not comment on how we calculate the equilibria by using the extensive form. Let me just maybe say in words. So I should also add, I'm focusing on the case now that the prior probability for the low type, for the high type, is strictly below 1/2. Why 1/2? 1/2, that's a critical parameter here in this model, because that's the probability at which the player 1 is indifferent between accepting or not. So when player 2 is indifferent between accepting or not. So when player 2 has to take a decision accepting or not, irrespective of whether she has seen the signal or not, because that's not payoff relevant for her, 1/2 is the probability at which she is indifferent between accepting or not. And this will define critical cases that we need to distinguish for our equilibrium analysis. So for the moment, I look at the case where the prior probability on the high type is below 1/2, and this is below the value where player 2 would accept. So in other words, the prior probability for on the types of player 1 on the high type is so low that without the signal, so to say, player 2 would not accept. And quite logically, we get then one equilibrium, which we call the no signaling equilibrium, where none of player 1's types signals, nobody uses the signal, and player 2 does not accept. That's a no signaling equilibrium. Actually, it's a component of equilibrium. I'm going to talk make a comment on why it's a component of equilibria. Obviously, because we have also actions of the equilibrium path. So what in classical game theory is called off the equilibrium path actions. I put this on the side for the moment. There is lots of things one could say about this, notably from the point of view of classical equilibrium refinements. But let me put it at the side for the moment. And let me say that for this paradigmatic case that we are looking at here, we have also a more interesting equilibrium, which is a partially revealing equilibrium. And this equilibrium has the property that the high type of player one produces always the signal, and the low type produces the signal with a certain probability. And player two, when she observes the signal, then she will accept with a certain probability. So how are these probabilities defined? So the probabilities with which the low type does use the costly signal. Remember, the high type always uses the costly signal, and the low type with some probability. And this probability is exactly such in equilibrium that when player two observes the signal, her updated probability that player one is of the high type goes up to that critical value, which is 1/2. So what the costly signal does here is it pushes the belief that player one is of the high type up to the critical value, and then player two accepts with a certain probability, which is such that the low type is indifferent between sending and not sending the signal. So now let me show you, I mentioned before that what we do is that we make a case distinction along these two dimensions, the signaling cost and the prior probability. So here what you see is a table, and I just will say in words what is captured in the table. So we make this case distinction first along the prior probability. So I've talked about the first case now so far, that the prior is below the critical value. We also look at the case that the prior is above the critical value, and we look at the case that the prior is exactly equal to the critical value. We don't do this for applications, but this is a very important theoretical reference point to see what happens with the equilibrium structure in this knife edge case. And it's also interesting for the dynamics, actually, because one sees that one dynamic pattern, how it changes from one generic case into the other. And what is very interesting, so and quite natural, the equilibrium structure changes when we change these prior probabilities. I have been talking about this first case so far, where we have a no signaling equilibrium and an equilibrium where the signal has the function of pushing the belief up. And so with a certain probability, the productive exchange to hire, to accept, happens with a certain probability. And so in the case where the prior that player one is of the high type is already above the critical value, this is a case that has been largely neglected in the literature. Very interestingly, we find three equilibrium components here. We have one component where everybody signals, where everybody, both types, use the signal, and we have a component where nobody uses the signal. And in the middle, dynamically, it will be a saddle point between these two equilibrium components. We have a partially revealing equilibrium where the low type never sends the costly signal and the high type sends the costly signal sometimes. So then I will just mention this without really explaining it. We can look at the case. So now we change along a different dimension. we change along, or we look at the variation of this by looking at the different cost parameter. We make the cost of the signal so high that the low type is indifferent between sending the signal and being accepted or not sending the signal. So the cost of the signal is 1 here. Again, we do this more for analytical reasons to look at this knife edge case. And also one can look at the case that the signal is above the critical value, which means that the signaling cost for the low type is above 1. And in that case, only in that case, one gets so-called fully revealing equilibria. That is equilibria where the high type sends the costly signal for sure, and the low type never sends the costly signal. Now, what is more interesting? Actually, let me jump right away to our pictures, to the dynamics. So what we do is we do the regular replicator dynamics, and so before I talk about the replicator equation, let me show you actually how we represent this graphically, because our dynamics will play in this space how we represent equilibria graphically. So we can present a strategy profile by a vector with 4 entries. We can let me take this entry here. So here, this corner here, this vertex here. So we have a vector with 4 positions, and the first position, the first 2 positions are for the action choice of player 1. So, and the first number is a probability, and this gives the probability with which the high type will express the costly signal. The second position is the probability with which the low type expresses the costly signal. The third position of this vector is the probability with which player 2 accepts if she has seen the costly signal. And the fourth position is the probability with which player 2 accepts if she has not seen the costly signal. So that allows us to write the so-called behavior strategies. So this is the behavior that every player has in each of their roles, in each of their agents in the extensive form. This defines this is a way of writing the strategy profile in behavior strategies in these games here. And so by this is of course what you see here, this hypercube is actually a projection of that space to something that we can capture in some sense in a meaningful way by this picture here, by this device. And let me show you where here our equilibria sit, so to say. What you see here is already the dynamics. So this picture allows me to give a short summary of the dynamic results we are going to have. What you see here, this point here, this E1, that's the equilibrium, this partially revealing equilibrium. And as you see, it sits in this phase here, which is defined by the following condition, that the high type, you see, it's this phase here where the high type always produces the signal. It has a 1 here in the first entry. This is what defines this phase here. Plus the second condition that player 2 never accepts when there is no signal. This is also a defining feature of this equilibrium here. You see, the equilibrium sits here, but in the position of the second player, so in this equilibrium, the second player will produce the signal with some probability. Now, of course, in a population-based dynamic setting, that means that a percentage or a fraction of the population of the low type, so in this population-based setting, we consider the 2 types of player 1 like as subpopulations of the player 1 population, and the 2 agents of player 2 also as subpopulations of the player 2 population. And so this is to say that when in this equilibrium, player 1, the high type, expresses the signal with a certain probability, of course, in a population-based setting, this is like saying that a part of player 1 population, a fraction of the player 1 population, expresses the signal and another part does not express the costly signal. And similarly for the player 2 population. So when there is no signal, nobody ever accepts. But when there is the signal, there is acceptance with some probability, meaning some individuals of the player 2 population, when they observe the signal, will accept with a certain probability. And so the point here you see in this light red color, that's the equilibrium point. And as we are going to see, this is something we show that in the replicator dynamics, this point here, this is our result. This point is, this equilibrium point is stable. It's stable in the sense of Lyapunov, but it's not asymptotically stable. It is actually surrounded by periodic orbits. And also what we can show is that each of these orbits attracts something positively measured from the interior of the simplex. So from the interior of the simplex, we have a non-zero set of initial conditions that converge to this periodic orbit. And we cannot really show this, but we have a conjecture that also we could not refute, that this phase all together here attracts something positively measured from the interior of the simplex. So that it is a local attractor, so to say. As I mentioned, there is another equilibrium here in that case, and that is, I said it's a component of equilibria, and this is the no signaling equilibrium component. And why is it not a point? Why is it a component? Well, it has to do because in this equilibrium, on the equilibrium path, what happens is that there is never the signal. So there is never the signal, and player 2 never accepts. But this equilibrium is sustained by behavior of the equilibrium path. So in case that there were the signal, and that is not uniquely defined. So to make it an equilibrium, that not sending the signal, not accepting, that this is an equilibrium behavior, there are multiple ways that player 2 could respond to the signal if it were received that sustain this equilibrium outcome. And this is why this is a component of equilibria here. Okay, and in the dynamics, there is one orbit. So this here is, so every point here in this equilibrium component is what is sometimes called neutrally stable, but the last point of this component here, so this is unstable. We have an orbit that goes down here to this corner, which makes this component altogether unstable. So we have one stable but not asymptotically stable and one unstable component. And we also do have a result. So we also look at global convergence, and we can show that globally there is convergence to the union of the following two phases: the phase in which this equilibrium sits here, and this phase here in which that component of equilibria sits. So let me, I will do the following. I'm sorry to, let me actually go right away to this picture here. So I will first continue to tell you what happens with the dynamics when we change these parameters. And only after I have done that, I will say a few words how we arrive at these analytic results. Because so when we see these pictures, one could get the impression that we are doing this with computer simulations, but this is not what we are doing. So there are real analytical results behind this. Yeah? So these results are not based on computer simulations. They are derived from analytical arguments. But let me first show you what happens when we change these parameters. So what you see here, so this is the case that I just discussed. This is the case. So I'm still, I'm looking at the case. Actually, maybe I should, yeah. So this is what happens when we move up at the cost of the signal for the low type. So we move it up, we move it above 1. So if we move the cost of the signal for the low type up above 1, what happens is the following. So this partially revealing equilibrium becomes, so to say, a fully revealing equilibrium. It sits in that corner here. That means high type signal, low type no signal, and player 2, if signal accept, if no signal do not accept. But very interestingly, the no signaling component stays completely as it was. And what you see here, this is this, so to say, knife edge case as far as the cost parameter goes, where the cost of the signal for the low type is exactly 1. That is to say, the cost of the signal is exactly what the player gains by expressing the signal. And as we see what happens, I think a nice way to imagine that is that this equilibrium plus the surrounding periodic orbits, they kind of move to the boundary and they become this equilibrium component here. And then what happens when we go further up with the cost, then this component, so to say, shrinks to this equilibrium point. So the way I like to see it, we try to play with that, but it's not as easy as that, to turn this into a movie, actually. So that one could see when one goes up with the cost, how the equilibrium structure changes and how the dynamics, how the dynamics changes in the hypercube. So in the next set of pictures, what I'm showing here, what we are showing here, is, so now here we move in another dimension the parameter. So here we play with the a priori probability on the high type. Here we set it exactly equal to 1. And what we see here is, so here we see the effects. Remember, this picture here now corresponds to the picture we had here before. So what happens here is that this partially revealing equilibrium, so to say, moves down here to this corner. And that's going to be an equilibrium component where everybody has to signal. And player 2 will then accept with at least some probability. And the no signaling component also becomes larger and becomes a component where when there is the signal, player 2 will accept with a probability that is low enough to prevent the players from switching away from their no signaling strategy. Maybe what is interesting for us in that is that we really see how the equilibrium structure changes when we play with these parameters. And in the dynamics, what happens now is that this here becomes a stable component. And this here is still unstable. This component here is still unstable, but this here becomes stable. And very similarly, we do this also for the other parameters. And here is the case that the prior probability is above the critical value 1/2. And this is the case I mentioned before, that we have, again here, in this phase here, we have sitting and no signaling. Sorry, this is the signaling component. This is asymptotically stable in the replicator. Sorry, no, it is not. It is stable, but not asymptotically stable. And this component is unstable. And in the middle, we have a saddle point. Okay, so now let me go back and explain how we get to these results. So, first, before we started doing this, or let me go to the dynamics actually. So what we do is we look at the simple replicator dynamics. And as you remember, our game is, we have a 4x4 payoff matrix. So we have two populations, and each population has a priori, when we look at this game in the matrix form, every population has 4 strategies. Now, what can be done, so we write this down very classically, we write down the replicator equations by using our payoffs. And then one could make the following interesting observation, that when we take the sum of the first and the last equation and the two middle equations of the replicator dynamics, they give the same sum. So the first and the last sum equals the second and the third. And this is true also for the payoffs of, this is true for both players. And so this allows us, so this property, it comes from that property, and we use a result, an earlier result by Josef Hofbauer and Carl Sigmund and Andreas Gaunersdorfer, that this property here, this is also related to work by Ross Cressman. This property dynamically means that the replicator dynamics is, so we have a constant of motion for the replicator dynamics, and that the replicator dynamics corresponds to a foliation of invariant manifolds, so 4-dimensional invariant manifolds. And what we truly do, so when I was saying before, we have analytical results, what we really do is we look at the dynamics on this central invariant manifold. So we don't really look at the entire dynamics, but we look at the central invariant manifold when this expression here is 1. And so this is sometimes called in theoretical biology the right manifold. This is related, this goes back to work by Ross Cressman. And so this allows us to write down, to simplify our equations. And by simplifying the equations, more precisely, we can do a parameter substitution. And that allows us to transform the dynamics into a set of equations where we have 4 equations, each with 2 strategies. So it is like saying that we can write down, instead of looking at the dynamics or at the game between 2 populations, each with 4 strategies, we have a game between 4 populations, each with 2 strategies. And you realize that this is as if we were to write down the dynamics, not for the game in matrix form, but for the game in extensive form. So it is as if we were looking at the game in extensive form in the game tree by looking at each agent as a population of players. And so this might seem obvious, but it's not so obvious. This is part of our work that we show this equivalence actually. So in previous work, often people have just worked with the replicator dynamics in that form by looking at it as a game between four populations. But one of the contributions of our paper is to give actually a proof of that, or to be more precise, to show that the replicator dynamics in the agent normal form, so to say, in the extensive form, is equivalent to the dynamics on the right manifold, on the central invariant manifold, when we were to look at the replicator equations in the entire game. So this is maybe the core or the most general result we have. And also importantly, this result is true not just for the very specific payoffs that we have in our game. This comes actually from the extensive form that we have. So for any extensive form that one could write down, for any game that has the same extensive form, for any payoffs we could write at the end nodes of the game tree, the same would be true. And this is what allows us, this is what allows us to get these dynamic results, because we have simplified the dynamics, so to say. Now, I said before that I have just a few minutes left, so maybe what I would like to say a few words. What are the generalizations of these results that one could do? So remember, first, with the payoffs, the game I showed, there was the assumption that there is really a difference in the cost of production for the two types. And one thing that we also show is that structurally, we get the same equilibrium structure and also the same qualitative properties of the dynamics when we look at a slightly different game, which is the game you see here. And this game has the following, presents the following variation. So in this game here, instead of saying, or instead of assuming that the two types of player one have different costs in producing the signal, we say they have the same cost of producing the signal. A typical example would be advertising. So usually in advertising, there is a certain cost for the advertisement. For example, to buy a newspaper advertisement, there's a fixed cost. So it's not as a function of the quality of the firm that the price of the advertising changes. But we assume a fixed cost, but there is, and this is an assumption we need actually to get the same equilibrium structure. We say, or we make the assumption that if a good product is, if there is acceptance for the good quality product, then the consumer will buy again, and this gives an extra payoff to the high type. This is what you see in the payoffs here at the end nodes of this tree here. So you see, we give the same cost, little c, to the two types, the high and the low type. So this is now, when we think of advertising, is a good high and low type, high and low quality of the good. And both firms can or cannot buy, let's say, the newspaper ad. But then there is the assumption that the high quality product, if it's bought once, gets a higher payoff, a little d here, an increment, a payoff increment. And the argument that is given in the literature on advertising is that if the quality is good, there are repeat sales. And this is why, so the function of advertising is more to attract the consumer. And if the product is good, the consumer will buy again. If the product is bad, the consumer will not buy again. And that's why the low type does not have this incremental payoff little d, even when the consumer buys. And what is interesting, this is besides any dynamic analysis, is that this game has exactly the same equilibrium structure as the game I've shown before. Also for all these different cases we have. So for playing with the parameter p, little p for the prior probability, and also playing with the cost parameter. We just have to think as what was the cost parameter for the low type, replace by c, the parameter c that we have here. So there is a simple, actually it's written here, there is a simple parameter transformation if we replace c1 by c over 1 plus d, then in the calculations for the equilibria, then we get exactly the same equilibrium structure. And not only the same equilibrium structure, but it will also have exactly the same, the dynamics will have exactly the same qualitative properties. I will maybe not speak so much about applications. I think once one has the model, it's fairly easy to think of many applications. I will rather say a few words on, so what I've said so far, this was about the first paper we had together with Josef, where we played through all these different versions of the standard costly signaling game. So all in all, we have 9 different cases and these two big classes. So different cost in production and fixed cost in production of the signal, but differential benefits. So in some sense, we have 18 classes in some sense. So now let me quickly talk. So this was a follow-up paper where we expanded the methods we had to a particular kind of game that is very popular in the game theoretic literature, the so-called beer quiche game. And the difference here is that, I will just tell the story, what's the difference with respect to the game we just saw. So the story here is that a signal is not of a cost, but players, so player 1 gets a positive payoff increment from producing a certain signal. So there is one signal, and to keep it very close to the notation we had, so we say that there is a signal S that the high type likes to produce. So when the high type produces S, this gives her or him a positive payoff increment little d1. For the other type, the low type gets a pleasure out of producing S bar. This gives the low type a payoff increment d2. So we can think of this, for example, as different preferences for different styles. So that could also have applications, I guess, in, I don't know, for example, fashion, food, industry, things like that. Or also in sociological applications where it's about persona, applications in linguistics where different speakers might have preferences for different forms of speech. But also there is a very nice interpretation given in Bill Sandholm's book. He doesn't discuss the dynamics of this game. It's actually not his book on dynamics, but another book, I think it's lecture notes, where he gives a very nice interpretation where he says, okay, the beer quiche game could be interpreted in the sense that there is something like a conventionalized meaning of the signals. So imagine S really means I am of the high type, and S bar really means I am of the low type. And then the payoffs, these payoff increments, can be explained by a preference for truthfulness. So if the high type says, I am of the high type, this gives him an extra payoff because he says the truth, and similarly for the low type. So if he says, I am of the low type, this gives an extra payoff. Yeah? So that's an interpretation that has been given. And then, there is still some work to do because the dynamics is not exactly the same. So it constitutes a different class. But what I find interesting is actually to see what happens to the equilibrium structure. So maybe I should make that comment here. Why do I insist so much on all these different cases that we do? Because it's rather unique to our approach. It might sound very straightforward if one is interested in evolutionary dynamics. In some sense, when one does evolutionary dynamics properly, one always needs to look at the entire state space and all the possible equilibria to understand also stability and global convergence. And this is just what we do. But strangely, it has not been done in these articles I mentioned before. So very often people have looked just at particular equilibria and not discussed other equilibria and have not discussed global convergence. And similarly, quite surprisingly, there is really a very, very long list of papers on the Birkish game, but nobody has so far looked at the dynamics in this game. And the case you see here, this is again the case that the prior is very low. So a priori, very low probability on the high type. And very interestingly, what happens here is, in relation to the model we saw before, the no signaling equilibrium component, so to say, disappears. And we only have this equilibrium here. It has exactly the same properties. So it's surrounded by periodic orbits. Each of them attracts something positively measured from the interior of the simplex. And we can also, again, we can play this through for other cases of the prior probability. For example, here again, we see how this changes, that this component, so to say, moves back. And also for this case that the prior is very high already. Maybe I should mention that this is the case that has been very important in the game theoretic, in the classical game theoretic literature, because we have these two equilibrium components here. And by classical equilibrium refinement methods, there are arguments this has been used a lot in equilibrium refinements, forward induction and divinity and all these kind of refinements. And these are arguments that will select the signaling component and will select against this no signaling component, which is also what we see, what we do by the dynamic analysis. So I understand that I am out of time. So that's why maybe let me show only one slight variation, and I'm done in 1 minute. This is work in progress. What we do here is we also look at the case that player 2 has to pay a cost when he accepts a player 1 that has produced the signal. And this is something that can have applications in the economics of platforms, for example, where if you accept someone, you have to pay a cost, a commission. And it's a very subtle change, but this picture should show the change. What happens here is that, again, nothing happens to the no signaling equilibrium component, but the signaling equilibrium component, or this partially signaling equilibrium component, will move a little bit closer to the fully revealing equilibrium. So I'm just showing this one picture here for this one case. There are more things that are happening. We get this fact of introducing the cost for player 2 when she accepts. Instead of 3 different cases, we are going to have 5 different cases. And very interestingly, because this is a little bit counterintuitive, it shifts the the partially revealing equilibrium closer to a fully revealing equilibrium. So maybe I stop here, and I could say something about applications during the discussion.
Thank you very much